he did a great job of reading what my mother prepared as an introduction for me. So I'm going to try to do as much as possible today on the way to these 3 lectures. Just like the American movie industry, this is a trilogy. You won't get to the exciting climax until the last lecture, so you all have to keep coming back. But I'm told that if you happen to miss one, there is a recording here. So you can have the second best, the Netflix version, as it were, streamed at home. So today what I'm going to do is an overview, all 3 really quickly, so you know where we're going. And then I'm going to talk about structures. The other 2 lectures are mechanisms and dynamics, which Lucio kind of sketched out. So after the motivation part will come the overview. After the overview, you'll get structures, which is a discussion of why a system approach is better, why we should think about this in the context of empire, and then finally, money and quasi-state money. So are we ready? Okay. So the motivation is pretty simple. Dollars like the weather. Everybody always talks about how the dollar is going to collapse, but somehow it never happens. So this is The Economist in 2004. It is the media, but of course it's also the voice of the financial elites along with the Financial Times, which is part of the same media empire. So we kind of sort of have to take them seriously as the voice of the private financial actors that people like Triffin, Green, et cetera, worry about. And even though they were worried in 2004 and 2007 and 2006, eventually they changed their mind. And by the time we get down to 2016, they're like, oh yeah, the dollar actually pretty strong. So the media worries about the dollar and academics also worry about the dollar. I'm not going to read these quotes, but I'll just call out this one because Kindleberger is not an idiot and in fact quite the opposite. And what you're going to hear is in some ways very closely related to his argument. But even Kindleberger, 1981, the dollar is finished. Okay, so why so much pessimism and what's wrong with this pessimism? So here's the motivation for the academics for most of the post Bretton Woods era, which is a bad way to put it because there is no Bretton Woods era. But from Triffin, 1960 forward, what most people are worried about when they think about the dollar are these 2 lines, which start in 1976 because that's the data I have. But the first line is the red line, which is the US current account deficit, which has been pretty continuously negative for the past, in this case, 45 years, 48 years. And that, of course, cumulates into the blue line, which is the US net foreign debt. So the US has a continuously growing net foreign debt. And if you were looking at a country in the abstract, you're sitting in a glass tower in Frankfurt, you're sitting in a glass tower in Singapore or New York, and you just saw this chart without that blue bit at the top, you'd be thinking, well, this is like Brazil or Mexico or Thailand. Maybe we should maybe not lend money to this country. It's not in such great shape. And if you read headlines from the newspapers about the politics of that country, and they were sort of talking about these kinds of people with, again, out the formal names, you might be even more concerned about the dollar. And yet, as Galileo said, per si muove, it's still there. Okay, so why in the face of this continuously rising net foreign debt, and why in the face of this extraordinary political dysfunction are we still living in a dollar world, and to what extent is that not going to persist? And the very short answer here is that the dollar functions as global quasi-state money, and I'll explain what that means, for a global empire centered on the US as a political system and as an economy. And it's very hard to extract that from the world economy. It's a bit like taking the skeleton out of the body. The consequences are probably not going to be so great for the system. So that's the motivation. Here's basically the summary. And the summary starts, as we always do, with what do other people think? Because we all write in genres. So what other people think is this. This is the view from Triffin through Eichengreen, Cohen. If you don't know these names, don't worry about them. They're the literature. Basically, what these people think, and I'll just call them the North American view, what they have done is replicated Triffin's original concern about the US dollar, and they do so on the basis of the same assumptions that underlay Triffin's argument. And those assumptions are the ones you see here. Those assumptions are that money is fundamentally a commodity money. It's based on metal, and if it's not based on metal, it's a commodity in and of itself. So they're a bit distant from money as a social relation. And you can see this ghost of the gold standard very explicitly in Triffin, and then in a more muted way in Cohen, Eichengreen, etc. They have a loanable funds model of the economy. Loanable funds, just put your hand up if you know what that means. Oh, okay, great. So I don't have to explain all this, but loanable funds, for the ones that didn't put their hands up, is the kind of naive understanding of banking. You save money. It's the Angela Merkel view. You save money out of your household account. You put it in the bank lends it to someone who will use it. So savings precedes investment in the loanable funds model. There's a belief that economies are largely self-contained. The BIS has been calling this the triple coincidence or island model. The triple coincidence is that the economic zone, the currency, and the legal system all coincide and are relatively self-contained. In this view, private actors have the last move. If they don't trust your money, they will flee. Because they can flee, you have to respond to their preferences. You as a state have to respond to their preferences. And this is the kind of bond vigilante view of the world that existed in the 1990s under the Clinton administration. Those private actors are typically seen as homogeneous, disembodied financial actors out there in the world somewhere. Okay? In this view of the world, what matters most is foreign exchange reserves. That's the key indicator of power in the world. If your share of foreign exchange reserves is shrinking, that indicates that there's a problem with your currency. And that's linked to the Bretton Woods era concern with balance of payments crises in a world in which there's very little in the way of free mobility of capital, and in which foreign exchange reserves actually functionally did matter because that's what you used in times of balance of payments deficits. And those deficits are the ultimate constraint on your behavior in terms of macroeconomic policy. So that's the North American view, and that's what gives you Triffin, or that's what comes out of Triffin. And Triffin has these same assumptions, and Triffin's original dilemma was a tension between liquidity and confidence. So two things are important here. The first is that what people think Triffin said isn't actually what he said. Triffin is cited but not read. We have a view of liquidity versus confidence that just uses those words, but Triffin meant something very specific by the tension between liquidity and confidence, and that was that there was not going to be a sufficient expansion of dollar-denominated global trade credit. That was the liquidity problem, because the confidence problem, at some point, the volume of dollars offshore in the form of trade credit was going to exceed the physical gold in Fort Knox in the US. And so there would be no convertibility of dollars into gold. So it's confidence in the convertibility of dollars into gold. We don't live in that world anymore, but it wasn't really wrong for this Cold War 1.0 era. It wasn't really wrong for like 1960 to 1968. If you change the assumptions, then you get a different view of the problem, and the more modern understanding of liquidity versus confidence, which you can see in Eichengreen and Cohen, basically thinks about liquidity as the supply of dollars, again, still mostly for trade credit, and confidence is a generalized confidence in the US economy. And they're not wrong to make that move, but they're still anchored in these assumptions, and that's the problem. So what I want to argue is that we should have a different view of money in the global economy. And I'm calling that the New European view. But by the way, these labels are not fixed. If you have better ideas, Stefan Murau, who is right there, kind of on board with this view, likes old and new, or generation one, generation two. But, we're in the movie business, like I said at the beginning, so we need catchy labels. So for the moment, old North American view, new European view. New European view because most of the people who do this approach are, in fact, Europeans. Within that, most of them are Germans, which is an interesting thing, given that Frau Merkel and the rest of the German population seem to have this loanable funds view. But this view is different. This view says money is not commodity money. Money is a social relationship. It is fundamentally about debt, therefore also credit. Every asset has a matching liability. Every credit has a matching debt. And money is fundamentally anchored in what the state says is money. And the reason is that there's a hierarchy of monies. There's a hierarchy of debt that rests on the acceptability of debt. So all of you who've ridden on Deutschbahn and you get those nice letters in the mail saying you don't have a credit, because we were 3 weeks late with your train, which we anyway canceled, and so you had to walk. That's money. That's money. It's a debt. It's a credit to you. It's a debt to Debon. It's money. Its acceptability is limited. You can't put it in the coffee machine out there and get coffee. Okay? But you accept it because maybe you can use it on Debon. You can imagine a hierarchy of money going up from that or from frequent flyer miles up to what the state says it will accept for payment of taxes. And that's the highest powered money because it's backed by a very strong form of acceptability, which is that, and here's the big asterisk, assuming there's a high level of state capacity, if you don't honor that debt, if you don't pay your taxes, there will be some form of coercion employed against you. And so money that's backed by the state, meaning the state says it will accept it as payment of taxes, is the highest form of money, okay? And beneath that, all other monies are arrayed with varying degrees of acceptability. Okay, second big difference is that acceptability of state monies, plural, is a function of domestic class struggle, state institutionalization, state capacity is the way I prefer to think about it. So those things matter. They matter for how credit's created in the economy. That credit is created endogenously. Banks create money. Again, just because I don't want to actually spend too many words on this, hands up, endogenous credit creation. Most everybody, okay, again, the one sentence version for those of you who haven't heard this before is that banks create money. It's not savings preceding investment. It's banks simultaneously creating on their balance sheet an asset to the bank, which is a loan, which they then immediately fund as a deposit to the borrower. The loan is an asset for the bank. The deposit is a liability for the bank. Banks create money. Okay, that's endogenous credit creation. The problem with that is it tends to lead to Minsky-type crises, and I'll talk more about that later. And so in that view, it's credit creation that matters, not reserves. Reserves are at the long end of a chain of transactions. The starting point is this endogenous credit creation by banks, some of which is validated by states. Okay, so the balance of payments constraint, irrelevant, especially if you're at the top of the money hierarchy. Thank you, Alan Greenspan. Thank you, Janet Yellen. Thank you, Mr. Powell. You guys in the Eurozone, it's not quite as good. Sorry. And the last important feature here or assumption here is that we're in a global system. I'll talk much more about that, obviously. But the critical point here is that late development is a pervasive feature of the global economy. And for reasons I'll explain in more detail later, this tends to create deflationary pressures in the world economy. What offsets that is the US current account deficit. That's a feature, not a bug, except for the political consequences, which was that montage of Republican politicians I showed you a few bits ago. Okay, last bit of the overview. Those generate the 6 contradictions that Lucio mentioned. This is a kind of schematic for that. I'm not walking through it. It's going to be the bulk of the third lecture. But this is where we're going, okay? what I'm going to do is lay out why you should think about it as not just liquidity versus confidence, but these 6 different tensions. So settle in. It's a long, just like the Lord of the Rings extended version. You're going to be here 10 hours. Okay? So settle in. Here we go. So first point, you need to start from a system level approach. Apologies to my sponsor who in the growth model work basically started with a kind of unit level approach. But the reason you need to think about it from a system level approach is that helps you understand what is going on with the creation of credit in what I'm going to call global quasi-state money. So if you think about the world, right, we can see the world, and there's a lot of different ways to see the world. And you could put a map of the world up with countries that have borders. You can put up a cartogram or choropleth of the world with countries sized by GDP. What's built into that map is an assumption that countries are units, that they're, again, in that triple coincidence that the BIS talks about as not being real. And I don't think that's the right way to do it. So I'm just going to show you a different way to look at the world, which is this. So our friends at McKinsey, who are the arbiters of everything that's true in the world, because, right, broke the world up into 40,000 micro regions with, as you can see here, an average $3 billion of GDP. And that actually corresponds much more closely to the world in the sense that we know that there are these agglomerations of economic activity out there. You can take the 12 train north of the city, and you'll see an agglomeration of economic activity on both sides of the Rhine. One side is Ford and its suppliers. On the other side, BASF and Bayer and their suppliers. If you take a different train, the 9, you'll go to Königsforst, and you don't see very much economic activity out there. There's not even a cappuccino stand in the middle of the forest, which is like an opportunity for those of you who don't want to finish the PhD, right? And so they map them, and you can see that there's a dispersion here between per capita GDP, this is a log scale, and life expectancy, which I'm going to use as a proxy for state capacity. So there's a lot of variation there that is different from the usual state-centric, nation-centric view of the world. So when we think about what is driving that, what makes that, a unit level view would say, okay, look, we have discrete political units. They have their own internal class struggles or political dynamics. And that produces an observable, which is here's the US with GDP of $23 trillion. Here's China with $16 trillion. And these units all generate a variety of products. And by aggregation, you end up with a world economy that has a pattern of current account deficits, current account surpluses, okay? And so in that view of the world, which is the view of Eichengreen and Cohen, all these different units issue money, and there's a tournament competition among those monies in which private actors, who are the decisive actors here, pick which one they want to use. So when we look at the world, we see economies, they issue money, private actors decide which one has the lowest transaction costs and therefore is the easiest to use. And that decides which money is at the top of the global hierarchy, which Cohen actually, to his credit, does see. And the problem with that is what this generates is types, and I'll make a very strong claim here, types without a theory of types. We don't know why countries are different aside from these domestic class struggles. It's an inductive approach, going to be deductive here. And that leads you to fallacies of composition. And the classic fallacy of composition here is, and this is not what Lucio does, but not everyone is that smart. The classic fallacy of composition here is what you see sometimes from the BIS or the World Bank, the IMF. You should all have export surpluses in order to get growth and solve your growth problems. And the problem with that, of course, is if we all have export surpluses, who's buying this stuff, okay? So the better way to understand this is to look at things from a system perspective, which also gives us a good handle on the long term here. So some local wisdom, right? Germany, we have always had to export, right? And the question is why? So let's think about this deductively instead of inductively and do a system level approach. And this is fundamentally, no surprise for those of you who know me, this is an economic geography approach. And the economic geographers basically say that the market is a system, and it creates heterogeneity in the world. If you think back to that plot of dots, the market creates that plot of dots. The market is not a homogenizing force. All that stuff, you young people don't remember this, and it's just as well. You were not reading the literature in those days, but all that stuff in the 1990s about globalization will homogenize the world is flat, makes no sense. Okay, the market creates heterogeneity. These economic geographers argue that produces heterogeneity in what's produced, how it's produced, which is critical for wage levels, and that you have agglomeration. There's a concentration of industry north of Cologne, but if you go east, there's no industry. In that view of the world, the biggest source of aggregate demand is what structures the division of labor. And also, there is room for states to push back against that, but they're pushing back against this systemic force. And so that approach would look like this. There's a global division of labor. As Adam Smith tells us, degree of intensity of that division of labor is a function of the size of the market. So aggregate demand tells you, the size of aggregate demand tells you what kinds of potential production systems can come into the market. If per capita income, let's just say globally, is $1,000 per person or 1,000 euro per person, you're not getting car production. The income level is not high enough to generate that. If the global market is big enough to generate demand for, and these numbers are not chosen arbitrarily, big enough to generate demand for 2.5 million cars, you'll get 10 car factories, more or less, existing in the world, because maximum economy of scale for car assembly is around 250,000 units. So 2.5 million divided by 250,000 gives you 10 units. And so in this view of the world, what you're seeing is not countries doing things because they have some inherent internal comparative advantage that emerged from class struggle. What you're seeing is production sites being called into the market as aggregate demand grows. And so maybe the first 10 car factories are in the 3 largest zones in terms of economic demand: North America, Western Europe, Japan. The 11th one might emerge somewhere else, but that 11th one won't emerge until demand is high enough to demand that additional 250,000 units. And so this is a fundamentally different view than a growth model view, right? What this says is we have a structured division of labor in the world with production units coming in as aggregate demand grows. Geopolitics matters for this. Why? Because most countries are in a situation of late development after the Industrial Revolution starts in the 19th century. And here's your connection to states and state money. For very obvious reasons, states did not want to be on the losing end of the Industrial Revolution. They start endogenously generating demand. They create money. They create credit. It brings production into being. And I'm going to talk about why that creates deflation later in more detail. Just take it for granted. But the central point here is late development produces chronic oversupply in world markets. And that chronic oversupply generates deflation over the long run. Okay, again, we're human beings. We are subject to cognitive problems. One of the big cognitive problems is recency bias. So, there was this inflationary moment over the last few years. But the point here is don't think about those last few years. Think about the long run. And here's the reality of the long run from my point of view. There's a 1982 VW Golf, and here's a 2018 VW Golf. I have intimate experience of both of them. And this one $17,000 in real dollars, $2018, $22,000. For this one, it looks like the price went up until you start thinking about what is in these cars. Okay? So pick that one random commodity, or to pick something that maybe is more crucial, 1 kilowatt hour of electricity in 1890 cost about $9 US, call it €8.50. By 1920, the price was down to $1.15, call it €1. Today, the price of electricity, by the way, these are real dollars. Today, the price of electricity for a 1 kilowatt of electricity where I live in Virginia, about 10 US cents, €9. Capitalism produces deflation, okay? So the assumptions in what you're going to hear going forward here are we have to think about the dollar in systemic terms. What's the dollar doing in terms of global aggregate demand? How does that then relate to the production systems we can see? Everybody there? Okay. All right, second big thing, empire. So the organizing framework for the political side here, because it's states that issue money, is empire. And the important thing about empire, which I'll say in a more detail in a minute, is they also are heterogeneous, and I'll explain why. And I'm going to also give you some facts about the world. So the starting point here is Michael Mann. Michael Mann taught at LSE. He took Max Weber's class status party article that's in Economy and Society, and he said, actually, there's 4 things here, not 3 things. What Weber was talking about was the basis for social organization, the basis for social power. Michael Mann said, if we take those 3 and break up party into actual violence and then political power, it gives you these 4 things: ideological power, economic power, military power, and political power. And his colleague at the London School of Economics, Susan Strange, then said, that's a good idea. This is a good approach. I will write about international political economy from this perspective. So in the IPE literature, people don't talk about, and very rarely talk about Max Weber, except recently Andrea Binder. They hardly ever talk about Michael Mann. They mostly talk about Susan Strange. And what she said was knowledge power, which is not quite ideological, military power, production, and critically, she starts talking about credit. Okay? So why should we think about how these forms of power are manifested in the world in a framing of an empire, and also critically why credit in a framing of empire? So the important thing here is don't think about the elephant in the room, which is to say, don't think about Africa 1880 as your model of empire. And also, don't think about Hart and Negri. What I want you to think about is empire is a structured system of power that is heterogeneous in terms of the relations between the center and the periphery. There's not one pattern in those relations. So when I say that, what I mean by that is that if you look at a country like Canada, you can have people like David Kaleo, who's a very smart person, saying the Reserve Bank of Canada functions as the 13th Federal Reserve District. What does he mean by that? What he meant by that was the Canadian economy was so integrated with the US economy that the central bank, which in a growth model approach or a unit level approach would be independent, running monetary policy for Canada, is effectively just an arm of the Federal Reserve. Okay? When you think about heterogeneity, you can think about American relations with Australia. So you may know that the Biden administration and the Congress recently passed the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation, everything to do with geopolitics. One big part of that is electrification of the automobile industry. Electrification requires lithium. Lithium is 50% sourced as a raw material from Australia. The IRA says to get the tax credits for batteries, electrical vehicles, et cetera, the product has to be manufactured in America with about 90% American content, domestic content. Well, that's a problem if 50% of world lithium comes from Australia. So the Biden administration says, well, we have this law, Defense Production Act, and we've made a deal with Australia that's legalized by the Defense Production Act, which is what it sounds like, that recategorizes Australian lithium as domestic for the purposes of this law. That's heterogeneity. Chile, which is also a major source of lithium, doesn't get that deal. So there's heterogeneity in these relationships. And you also have subsystems of rule. Again, you can think about NATO if you want, and I will have some words about that. So when we're thinking about the world today, you should think about it this way, right? We have empire. There's a tendency towards centralization, but not towards homogenization. There is central money. There is money that is localized. There is an interface between those monies. Again, just an example, in the 19th century British Empire, you had India sealed off from West Africa, sealed off from the West Indies. At the time that all of this is formalized, there are discrete currency boards for each of these regions, and they manage the relationship between central money, pound sterling, and between local money. The rest I'll skip, and except not everybody's in the empire, and as Murrell and van de Klooster say in a very excellent article, we are not living in a Westphalian world where countries have sovereignty. There are massive asymmetries, and those asymmetries are the essence of empire. And so you have Susan Strange saying explicitly, 1987, right, who's at the top of the empire? The US has the power to decide. That's how you know it's at the top. Now, not everybody agrees with that. My dissertation chair edited a book, America as an Ordinary Country, 1977. Another very smart person wrote this elegant deductive argument in 1984, titled After Hegemony. Again, a unit level approach. America is a normal country, but America is not a normal country. Okay, we see this in the numbers. I will run through these very fast, but this is to sort of hammer the point. So military spending, US is 40% of global military spending. It's asymmetrical. Where military forces are located, also highly asymmetrical. 800 US military bases around the world as of 2020. Those are the known ones. Not to put too fine a point on it, there are American troops in Germany. There are not German troops in America, except for training rotation. Those troops are used. This is a map of, among other things, drone strikes, okay? So military power, asymmetrical. Knowledge, again, this is certainly not what Mann meant. It's not quite what Susan Strange meant, but it's relevant to what I think is important, and it's relevant to the later lectures. Cumulative share of all R&D from 2004 to 2019. Without data for Switzerland, because it's incomplete, but it would be somewhere in there, you can see a pretty large asymmetry there. Remember that US GDP is about 22 or 23% of global GDP. If we look at private R&D by the 6,000 largest spenders, 2004, 2019, 2021, and we do scale it against GDP, you see basically the same pattern. US, that's what these numbers are, right? What's the ratio between R&D spending and GDP? And when you look at these numbers and you say, well, okay, but look, Switzerland is much higher than the US. Of course, the Swiss are neutral, so it doesn't matter. And what you don't have in Switzerland is a continental economy where big parts of that entity that's represented here are rural, agricultural areas, mining areas, and a lot of empty space, okay? When you look at production, here's where things start to break down. So China is now a much larger percentage of global manufacturing value added, averaging 2019, 2021, well above its share of global GDP, and then you can see the rest, and the putative center of this empire is actually quite small. It's below what you'd expect. And that's a relatively recent development. This is the longer run, shares of global manufacturing value added. You can see China here, and you can see the US on a steady decline. That's the balance of payments deficit. And that's the thing that should be keeping people awake at night in the glass towers. But the reason that they don't, as in 1929, jump out of those towers is this, which is what lies behind those value-added numbers and is, I think, more meaningful. And that's the share of profit, and also in blue, operating revenue. And here you see a completely different picture. This is the 20,000 largest firms with reasonably decent financial reporting in the Orbis database that have sales over $100 million a year. It's the big firms that run the world. And the US headquartered firms that are in that data set have a disproportionately high share of profits. Okay. Last thing, which is the trade networks themselves. So I reproduced this from the most recent UNCTAD report. And so thanks to Anastasia Nesvitailova, because she was the driving force for this. And what you see here in 2000 is 3 centers of global trade. Those nodes are places where these powerful companies are domiciled. And that changes, of course, to 2017, where China displaces Japan and becomes a bigger node than the US. So again, empire, right? But this is an empire that potentially is in decay. All right. Last bit, which is the critical bit for these lectures, is the dollar in the world economy. So how do we know the dollar is still central given all those other things? Military makes sense. Profits make sense. Production doesn't make sense. Where you really see this is in that thing I had in red from Susan Strange, which is credit creation and what happens when credit goes bad. So you're going to see some numbers on all of this. So here they are in one chart, and then I'll show you some social network graphs. So these are the dollar shares of bank balance sheets, claims and liabilities, global debt issues, foreign exchange reserves. I don't think they matter. Trade invoicing, and then the Fed has a synthetic index that aggregates all of these. And what you see is, again, huge disproportions. Most cross-border lending is in dollars. Most debt by banks, most debt issues are in dollars. Foreign exchange reserves in dollars, and then trade invoicing in the Americas, despite the fact that China is the largest trade partner of Brazil, Chile, Mexico, dollars. In the Asia Pacific, despite the fact that China is the central node, dollars. In Europe, the euro, of course, matters. Here's where it matters how you think about what is going on in the Eurozone, which is this a single entity or not? Nobody argues about the dollar share or the euro share of trade between Florida and California. But in Europe, at least, it's a different currency, although, again, the dollar is still 23%, and then the rest of the world. When you look at the actual flows, so this is a bit old, Jan Fichtner generated this. This is the flow of global investment, portfolio investment, FDI, and deposits. You guys are familiar with these social network type charts? Okay, so the US is central, and he argues, and I agree with him, that the other Anglo-speaking countries are essentially arms of this dollar-centered world. And when you look at foreign exchange trading, the dollar is also central. 2 things here. The first is that with foreign exchange trading, you have 200%, not 100%, because there's 2 currencies. Okay, so US dollar is 88% or 90%. Think of that as roughly half. The second is that when you look at pairwise trades, what is striking is that even between 2 very highly developed economies, right? So Japan, Eurozone, right? These are not poor countries. These are not countries with shallow financial markets. The direct exchange of euro and yen is only about, in 2012, about $79 billion. Most euro to yen exchanges go through the dollar. So the dollar is central. All right, putting that all together, those 2 things together, and then we'll talk about, apparently we're going to talk about money in the second lecture. What's going on here? What I want you to take away for the next 2 lectures is that we are in a global division of labor in which the US is the central node for the creation of credit. That credit is denominated in dollars, and it is validated through the US current account deficit and through disproportionate or differential growth that favors the US economy. And the reason that this should be thought of as an empire is that you can see that system of power. That's why I went through earlier. And that the dynamics here are generated by the fact that empires exist not just to preserve their power, but also to harvest resources from peripheries. So the core dynamic here that matters in the long run is the dynamic between how much growth occurs in these peripheries, because you want them to be richer, relative to how much growth is going on in the core economy. And the tension there around money, which I'll pick up in the next lecture, is that if the core economy cannot validate this credit that's being issued in its currency because it's growing more slowly than peripheral economies, and in this discussion, Europe is a periphery, Germany is a periphery. If it is not growing faster, it cannot validate that credit. But critically, what we see over the long run is the US does grow faster. And again, that goes back to this question of profits. So thanks for your patience. I will take questions, apparently after 3 minutes of contemplation.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you.